Thank you. It's good to see everyone back. It seems like we have quite a few people still out, but it's great to see everybody. And I know moms and dads, you are like very happy. School starts tomorrow, so I'm super excited. And but congratulations to you moms and dads making it through the summer. I'd like for you, if you take a moment, take out your program. Inside of it, you will find inside the program, the text is there for today, an outline if you want to follow along, and a place if you want to take notes. That's there for you, but you have the text available. This is our last week of Esther, and I've enjoyed going through this book. I've commented how much I enjoy this, and I know some of you have been out of town, and the summer is a time for people kind of coming and going, but this book is such a special book to me. I've enjoyed it so much, and if you've maybe not been exposed to the book, or you don't know that much about it, or maybe you've never read it personally, or you've never heard a sermon, it is an incredible book about this woman named Esther. And she's an orphan. Her parents have both passed away, and she's raised by her older cousin, a man named Mordecai. And so I'm going to do a little summary for you today, but I want to be up front and tell you, this is where I'm going to go. This is what I want to accomplish as we finish this book. And if you weren't here through this series, or you've not been exposed to this book, I would encourage you to take a little bit of time. It is not a long read, but you will you have that freedom to really get through it in one sitting and learn a lot. This is a really cool book of the Bible, and it does some neat things. But I want today to read to you a quote that kind of sets the tone, sets the mood for where I want to go. And it says this: "When we scrutinize the book of Esther for traces of God's activity, we are doing what the author intended us to do. The author would have us probe the events we witness in our own lives in the same way. The author is teaching a theology of possibility, the willingness to face history with an openness to divine providence, even when history seems to weigh against its likelihood, as it did in the dark days after Haman's decree. In this way, the book offers a stance of profound faith." So this is really what I want to do today. I want us to use those two words, to really scrutinize the text, to really get into it, to tear it apart, to see what's there. And I want us to really probe our own lives, our own history of the way that God has worked, because Esther stands out as such a special book. It's different from any other book in the Bible in that it never ever mentions God's name. It never mentions prayer or any of the things that the law would have said that the Jewish people, God's covenant people, need to do. This book stands in stark contrast to many other books, but I think it offers us a beautiful gift. And that gift is this, is that it allows us to really see how God works in very ordinary ways, with a sum adding up to his incredible providence in each one of our lives. It takes what we would call coincidences, and you see how God's fingerprints are over all of those things, leading to redemption. And because God is never mentioned, it allows us as readers, or it forces us to really have to dig into it, to really look at it and see what God is teaching. And I think that that's very true for our own lives, which is sometimes we want God to work in these massive miracles, these explosive and very quick ways, when oftentimes he works through those very ordinary means, but it's the sum of those ordinary means where you really see his hand of protection and of guiding, his sovereignty over all these details. And the book of Esther stands out to me in such a special way to teach us those things. The book of Esther is amazing. Esther, this orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai, ends up on this trajectory, and she gets to a place where she is the queen over the Persian Empire at a point when Persia was so incredibly expansive, so incredibly wealthy, so powerful. Their military had what was, some historians believe, over 1 million soldiers making it up. They were the epitome of strength, of power, of influence. They had the ability to basically enact anything that they want. And Queen Esther is in that place, taking a whole movement from being an orphan girl all the way to this place of incredible influence. But as we come and we get into this story a little bit more, we are introduced to the antagonist, this man named Haman, who I contend is the personification of evil. Haman hates God's covenant people, the Jewish people, so much that he enacts a plan. And this man, Haman, rises all the way up to something like a prime minister in all of Persia. And what Haman decides to do, and what he has the power to do, is he creates an edict. And this edict says that God's covenant people are to be exterminated, to be killed, a genocide, and it will get rid of a group of people that he absolutely hates. But Haman's number one place of hatred is that man Mordecai, the one who had raised Esther. Haman hates Mordecai so much that last week we saw that Mordecai, he has a plan for Mordecai, and Haman erects a massive, massive gallows pole, and his plan is to make sure that Mordecai is killed, murdered, and put on that pole. And you see all of these things, all this movement happening in this book, and it's really a perfect story because you see the incredible, incredible need that God's people have. You see this horrible individual who wants to enact genocide on God's people, but yet you see God's providence. You see God's goodness. You see God's fingerprints all over this story as he directs in such a beautifully quiet way. See, God stays anonymous through this whole thing. But as we scrutinize, as we really probe into the story, we see how God works. We see how he's sovereign over all of these things. And today we'll see how God brings justice, how God brings peace, how God brings restoration and rescue, and then a place of rest for his people. So let's look today at our text. If you'll pull out that sheet of paper that you have inside of your program, and let's look at Esther chapter 7, and we'll look through this first 7 verses. This is God's word. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked Esther, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for loving us and caring for us. Thank you for your mercy and grace in each one of our lives. Open up our eyes, open up our hearts to you this morning. May you work in us. Lord, may we see just a little bit deeper your commitment and care for us as people. Lord, your calling for justice, your holiness. Lord, thank you for your love. Today, as sons and daughters, we call you Father. We're grateful for you. And we ask that you would be honored and glorified during this time. And we ask all these things in your Son's precious and holy name. Amen. A long time ago, many of you will remember this, but my parents would not let me watch one show that I really, really like to watch. So I would invite myself over to friend's house. I would do whatever I could to see the show. And it was the A-Team, all right? Many of you have seen the A-Team. I guess after we watched, my brother and my sister and I, when we watched it, we were crazy afterwards enacting, whatever we had seen. But the A-Team, many of you will remember, was that band of 4 misfits, of those vigilantes that were being hunted in a sense because they had done some crimes, and they're on the run, right? And they would find people that were in trouble and bring some sort of justice to them, right the situation. And the show was one part engineering and extravagance. All those kinds of things were there. But I remember, and most of you will remember this too if you watch the show, that it would usually end with really the same quote by the character Hannibal, who's the one that always had the cigar. He would say this at the end after they were victorious, and in those 45 minutes of TV, right? He would say, "I love it when a plan comes together." And that was really like the tone of this show, was this band that brought justice. Well, today, when we head into this book of Esther, you see the plan coming together. You see what Queen Esther has done. And it is courageous and it's brave. And who she is, God uses in such a special way. But you see Esther's development as a character in these chapters, and it really, really starts to come out. Because when we first meet Esther, Esther is very complicit. She goes along with what she's told. She compromises. She lives in a way that God had never called his people to do. And you see God's sovereignty, that even in Esther's brokenness, God was still true to his covenant. But you also see how God is so caring with her, how there's such a commitment to her as a person. And as she develops throughout this story, you see a change in her. And that change really happens when Esther identifies herself with her people. When Esther really identifies herself with God's covenant people, there's a huge shift in her life. And she goes from a place of taking commands to now giving commands. And she comes up with a plan here, which is she knows that she has been put in this place. She has been put as queen of this massive empire for such a time as this, as Mordecai tells her. She has been put here by God, and the relationship between Mordecai and Esther really comes out in some of these chapters, where Mordecai really helps Esther to see that her life is so much more than just about her as an individual. He helps her to really see that she has an opportunity to be a major influence, that she has an opportunity to really see the bigger context of things. And even though he doesn't say God is working, it's so clear that he is by putting Esther in this place. So Esther has a job to do, and Esther takes that job on completely. And it's this: Esther would go on behalf of her people. She would be a mediator. She would go to the king and expose this attempt, this edict that was aimed at genocide for God's covenant people, and she would expose it to the king. But it was dangerous because Esther was Jewish, so she would be part of that edict. She would be part of what was coming. But it was also dangerous because she had no idea how the king would react. All of these things start to happen. The story gets so thick, but I look at what Esther did here and the plan she puts in place, and it's this. She goes to the king uninvited, unasked for, which we know from the text was an automatic death penalty. But the king accepts this, and she invites the king and Haman to dinner 2 different times. Now, this is interesting when you see the plans start to take place, because she invites the king, who she wants to petition to have this edict, this genocide stopped, but she invites the person who was the creator of it. So you can imagine for Haman, this looked pretty good. He has a very high position inside of this empire. He's like second in charge, but he dines with the king and the queen. And to Haman, everything looks like it's going according to plan. It's not very long until the Jewish people, the people he hated so much, would be gone. Esther enacts this plan. And as I look at what happens here, I think it's so beautiful. I think the way she works is so thoughtful. And if you look over the 2 chapters and you see the way that Esther comes to the place and how she designs this, you really see how God had uniquely gifted her for the job that he had called her to do. She's very smart. And a few years back, we went through a book in staff meeting that really was impactful. And I'd encourage you to get this book. It was called Crucial Conversations. And it talks about when the stakes are really high, when things really matter, and it's an emotionally charged place, These are a way to have very, very difficult conversations. The book made a big impact on me. And as I was going through and learning about Esther and reading about her, I thought Esther does several things, and some things I kind of pulled out of that book. One thing that she does when she talks to King Xerxes is, in a beautiful way, she's persuasive. She's not abrasive. She doesn't come out and tell him, look what you did. How could this happen? But she's very thoughtful in her approach. She clearly knows who she's talking to, and she comes persuasively. Another thing that she does is she shows a relationship between him and between her. Because every time in the entire book, Esther only refers to the king in the third person. She says, "O king," or she references him if it pleases the king. But Esther, in her request, really develops her care for him and the relationship that they have had. And even though there's points within that relationship that are very tenuous, I think Esther does something very beautifully here. And she shows care for him because she goes from using that third person to, she says, "If I have found favor in your sight." And she makes this connection to him that's relationally based, and that becomes the context for her to bring this petition to him. And she endears herself. And you see King Xerxes, when he hears her, when he listens, you notice the anticipation. You notice the interest in what is it that Queen Esther wants to ask for. And I think the beauty of having these two banquets is she only encourages that interest and speculation over what she might want. But a third thing that she does, I find so interesting about her strategy, how this plan comes together, is the third thing that she does. It's an interesting phrase in the text. And maybe you caught it when I was reading. It just seems odd. It seems out of place. And it starts really in verse 3. It says this: "Then Queen Esther answered, 'I have found favor with you, your majesty. And if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet. But no such distress would justify disturbing the king.'" So I think here she does something very interesting, very thoughtful, premeditated. She connects to his goals and his interests in an incredible way. Because what happens is, we've seen King Xerxes does not like to be bothered. He doesn't like things to go in a way that's not controllable. He wants it very simple. He does not want to be bothered. And she comes and she almost prefaces this whole petition by saying, I didn't want, if it was just something simple, if it was something small, I wouldn't want to bother you. But she highlights how important this is. And she also does something else. When Haman came to King Xerxes and asked permission and asked to have the resources to be able to get rid of the Jewish people, he does so in a very dark, in a very gray sort of way. What he does is, when he comes and he asks, he uses a word that could mean one of two things. It could either mean to enslave a group of people or basically put them under the watch and really put them down. Or it could mean to destroy them. And I really think out of the text, King Xerxes looked at that and we heard that, and maybe he was flippant at the moment with it, but he did not realize, it seems from this passage, that what Haman was asking for was to eradicate a whole group of people. So when Esther comes, when she has this conversation where the stakes are so high, she's saying, I don't want this. This is bad for you. This is bad for the kingdom. If it was something small, I wouldn't bother you. But realize your interests are at risk here. Realize that your goals for your kingdom are at risk. And she brings it and she exposes it to him. And I believe very strongly that his reaction of anger, of white hot anger over this, shows that he really didn't know what was going on. I see Esther here as someone who really had God's hand on her, of someone who had been called to do a job, of someone who had been called to a purpose, a rescue act, a redemption of people. And she is using and she is working, and God has given her the ability to do this. And I think that that's what is true for all of us. That in our calling as people, God has given you the resources, the things that you need to do it, and it's his hand that's guiding. It's his hand that's working. And a lot of times, God works more through the weaknesses that we have as people than our strengths. And I imagine Esther growing up as an orphan and struggling through that whole process. Now as queen, God has taken her on a journey, and he has prepared her for this moment. And God prepares us for the moments that he has called us to as people. And there they are, Esther, King Xerxes, and Haman, all at the same table. And this book probably mentions wine more than any other book in the Bible. And it's like a second day of drinking wine. And here they are, and she exposes Haman's desire and what he had planned to do right in front of him. Now, our author never lets us feel any sympathy for Haman. For just a moment, you can imagine. I mean, whatever piece of pork he had just put in his mouth was probably stuck in his throat. And his fork probably drops because he has been exposed. And Haman is there in a really, really difficult place. The chapter before, we learn that a gallows pole had been erected, that it had been built, that there was a construction project that Haman had started, and he had designed it for Mordecai. There's a Russian short story writer that I read an interesting quote that he had put out a long time ago. His name is Anton Chekhov, and he's like known as the master of the short story. But when he was leading a group of literary students, he would say this interesting phrase. He would say, if you in one scene, if you hang a pistol on the wall, you better go off in the next scene. Well, let me tell you what happens. A gallows pole has been erected in the previous chapter, and in this chapter, somebody's going to be on it. If we look back at our text, look at verse 7. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending to the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Look what happens to Haman. It's poetic irony, right? It's poetic irony that he had built this thing, he had built this structure to put Mordecai on it. And now he's hanging on it. And you have to imagine for just a moment, Haman heading to dinner that night with the king and the queen. Probably giddy, gleeful at what was about ready to happen because his nemesis, his arch enemy, Mordecai, is about ready to hang on this huge thing. That's what he wanted. That was his plan. And all of a sudden, the tables completely turn on him. All of a sudden, it's him on that pole. As I look at this, you see two things happening. You see a collision of human evil, and and Haman was that. He was evil. Every time when you go through this book, you see Haman's name, it's always associated with evil. He's always up to something bad. He is always doing something that is the opposite of what God would ever desire. That is who Haman is. There's 3 times in the entire book that Haman is happy. Each one of them is when he's either attacking people or he's designing to do something, like some type of killing, bloodshed. That is who Haman is as a person. And the more you get into the book, the more you see he is such an evil person. But you see human evil on display in Haman. You see the wickedness. You see like sadistic cruelty and design. And on the other side of this, we have the quietness of God. And we see divine justice start to move. We see God's fingerprints over this. We see how God works and how here is this man who desires such evil, and God is moving. And I would say this, that inside of our hearts as people, inside of the way that we were designed by God, we have a desire for justice. We believe that justice should happen. I heard a conversation this week about this Epstein guy, and these people were talking that they really wanted him to really have had justice. I think that's part of who we are. And I think of even stories like Shakespeare's Hamlet, where really it's a story about justice, where Hamlet is looking for who killed his father and looking to find a way to make sure the person that did it comes to justice. And I think one of my favorite books as a kid was The Count of Monte Cristo, where you go through this amazing story, this incredibly well-written story that blends very satisfying revenge alongside of people who had done something horrible coming to justice. And I think my kids love those Marvel movies. And I don't think any of us had a problem when Thanos was gone, right? That is in our hearts, that justice is something good, that justice is something that has to happen. And many of you have heard of Josephus, the historian, and Josephus wrote this about the book of Esther. He said, "In from thence I cannot forbear to admire God and to learn hence his wisdom and justice, not only in punishing the wickedness of Haman, but in so disposing of it, that he should undergo the very same punishment which he had contrived for another, because thereby he teaches others this lesson, that what mischiefs anyone prepares against another, he without knowing of it, first contrives it against himself." See, human evil, which I think defined as this, wherever it occurs and for whatever motivation, always sets itself against God, because God is the definition of goodness and righteousness. When it comes into contact with divine justice, which inevitably and inextricably means the destruction of evil, we see the working of a holy God and how he cares and how he protects and intervenes for his people. And I want us to look at this book because I think it teaches us something about God's justice today, that God really cares. And the fact that it's put in our hearts a desire for justice, I think for us as people, there's something satisfying to see someone like Haman who so wanted to do evil, his heart was set to destroy the image of God, so intent on evil, come to a place of punishment. And it happens in this poetic justice sort of way, where he ends up in the same place that he had destined for a man who was good, one of God's covenant people. But divine justice is something that I see coming out of this book of Esther. And for just a moment, I want us to look at a couple observations that we see and that we learn about God from this, about his justice and the way that he works. The first is this. We see that God holds the world's scales in his hand from the book of Esther. That the world's scales are held in God's hand. That God is in charge and he's sovereign. And his providence extends over all of these things. The book of Esther shows it to us so beautifully. That he's in charge of everything. One of my favorite parts of the book, one of the key parts of this book, is that one night the king cannot sleep. He can't go to sleep one night. And you see that what happens is he asks one of his advisors to come in and to bring the records of the kingdom and to read those records about just the history of his reign. And in those records is a mention of an unrewarded moment for Mordecai. Because Mordecai had thwarted a plan. He brought to light a plan of assassination against the king. And it was eradicated, and those people were actually put under judgment for that. But in that night when the king couldn't sleep, is when God was working in a special way. And you see the incredible wealth and power and the influence of this empire. And you see how God's hand in something very simple and ordinary, like a night's sleep that isn't really a good one, how God works. See, I see God's hand over these scales of history, how he's in control of every detail. And if he controls someone's night's sleep, you see all the way to how God preserves his people throughout their history because he had made a promise and a covenant with them all the way back in the book of Genesis, that God still was doing those things. And he holds and he has control over everything that happens, that he's sovereign and that he's good. The second thing we see about God from this book of Esther is that God intervenes for his people. See, I tell you about that covenant, a covenant of protection, a covenant that happens in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, where God makes a promise that he will take care of his covenant people throughout. And we see that God's covenant, his promise was good, even in moments of incredible brokenness on behalf of his people. Because we see that when God made a promise, he was good, that he kept that promise. And even though God's people at this time seemed to be so secular, seemed to be so far from him, God is still working on their behalf. And I see the beauty of it not being merit-based, but it's God-based. It's his choice. It's his grace in their lives. And God intervenes, with justice for them. Because like Josephus says, it's not just that God removed what was going to happen. He disposed of it. He made it go away. He eradicated it. And everything that Haman wanted to do that was evil is gone. You see how God intervenes on behalf of his people. The third thing you see is that God is holy and he hates evil things. God is holy, and holiness is not something that God just puts on, but it's something all throughout Scripture that is clearly shared with us. It's shown to us that God is holy. I think sometimes there's a more modern view of God, that God is kind of complicit, and whatever the message is of the day, you can kind of just make it fit into whatever God is. And it's over-focused on things that are very true about God, but yet they don't encompass who he is. And see, in God, there is a call, there's a demand for holiness, there is a standard. And Haman is completely on the other side of that. Haman is completely on the other side. And there is a demand for justice because God is holy. Now, when I think about that, when I really delve into God being holy, it's a scary thing. Because we may not look at Haman and say, oh, I'm all like Haman. But we see in a moment the pride. We see our own brokenness. We see our own struggle with sin. And we see God's holiness. And we realize the deeper we go into our own stories, that brokenness and that sin has separated us from God. But I want us to see something. Not only is God holy, he intervenes for his people. And it's why the cross is so important. See, the cross is what bridges that gap between a holy God and a broken world, a world that struggles with sin. God provides redemption. And see, the cross is something so beautiful because the cross is a moment of divine justice and human evil colliding. Because the cross is this. It's God's justice. It's God's holiness on full display in that moment. And see, for a moment, if you think about it, I titled this sermon, Trading Places. Because really, Haman had designed this gallows pole for Mordecai, and Haman ends up on it. But on the cross, there's another trading places where Jesus says, I'm going to go. I'm going to take the full brunt of God's wrath for you. I will take the punishment that you deserve. I'll take it on me, and I will take it. And he trades places with us as people. And you see God's justice in that moment of Christ's death, where he takes upon himself our brokenness, our struggle, and our sin. He takes it upon himself, and he pays for it. He takes a punishment he did not deserve. And the holy Son of God, fully man, fully God, gives his life in the most beautiful act of sacrificial love for us. See, Esther this book acts as a beautiful signpost, as a reminder, as for us to see as people that the Messiah was coming. And we can look back and we can see it, because all of these things happen, and we see at the cross how justice is served, how justice happens, and now there's freedom. There's an opportunity for us as people to really, really connect with how much we've been loved, and how salvation is not by works, but salvation is by God's choice and his grace in each one of our lives. See, all of us have a desire for justice. We do. And in Christ, in that moment on the cross, he gives his life for us, is the most incredible act of justice and part of bringing us into his family. So you look at this and you see the beauty of what the cross is. But I can only imagine, if we go back to the story of Esther for a second, the gleefulness, the giddiness of Haman when he had constructed that huge gallows pole as a massive monument, an edifice of the evil he was planning. And yet he ends up on it. And I think the cross is that same way. Because I think evil was so excited because the Son of God was going to be killed. And St. Augustine says it in a special way, in a really interesting way that I think helps us to understand it. Let me read what he says about the cross. He says, the devil was defeated by his own victorious achievement. The devil was exalted when Christ died, and by that very death of Christ was the devil conquered. As though he took the bait in a mousetrap, he was delighted at the death as being the commander of death. What he delighted in, that's where the trap was set for him. The mousetrap for the devil was the cross of the Lord, the bait he would be caught by, the death of the Lord. And our Lord Jesus Christ rose again. Now where is the death that hung on that cross? And I want you to think for just a second. The excitement of Satan, of evil. In the moment that Christ is put on the cross, he's dead. We're finishing this. He'll be dead. But it was a trap. And it was a trap in that moment because as Christ gave his life, he was defeating the very death he experienced. And what Satan most did not want to happen was that there would be redemption for God's people because of Christ's act on the cross that day. You see how beautiful that is? Do you see how God gave his life for us? How justice was served, and a holy God we can really see his love and his care and his commitment to us through the beautiful sacrifice on that day on the cross. And when evil was celebrating, it had no idea what was coming. That it was really Christ's mission of life, that he was coming to rescue his people. And see, Esther intercedes, she mediates for her people. And Christ goes to the cross, and today he intercedes for us. He's a mediator for us. And he brought us into his family in such a special way. God's justice was served. You know, if you think about it for just a moment, Haman was not just a singular character in Scripture. If you look over Scripture, you see that there were Hamans before Haman, just not named the same. And there were Hamans that were after Haman. There are people who have sought evil, those that run very quickly to bloodshed, those that have planned horrible things, those wrapped up in pride and their narcissism. You see those people, and it's hard for us not to miss the deep connection between Haman and Hitler. And I've thought for just a little bit about this, and I went to the computer and I Googled Esther, the book of Esther, Hitler, and Haman, and all of a sudden I started learning that Hitler had a very specific interest in the book of Esther. And an author, her name is Jo Carruthers from Drew University, and she worked at Oxford, wrote an essay about this. And she develops how Hitler had a very, very strong exposure to the book of Esther. And one of the things that he did on November 10th, 1938, in a speech, was he banned the celebration of Purim. Now, Purim, if you're not familiar with what that is, if you read in chapter 8 and chapter 9 in this book, the Jewish people establish a festival, a celebration for God rescuing them from Haman. And Purim began to be a time where the book of Esther is read, and there's jeering and dislike and anger over every time Haman is mentioned. And there's excitement when Esther is there and Mordecai, and they bring relief and rest to God's people. Well, Hitler hated Purim. He hated it. And he banned the celebration of it. And then what he ended up doing was, it not just that he banned it, but every year on the date of Purim, Hitler would do something horrible. And he would reenact moments out of the book of Esther, specifically chapter 8. In one of those, he has 10 Jewish sons hung on gallows poles as a representation of something that happened to Haman. And he did this every year. He hated so much what this book represented. But you see the deep connection between who Haman is and his evil, and who Hitler was and his evil. And you see a connection between these two people. Well, it goes on a little bit more. See, not only did he ban Purim, he banned even the reading of the book. He hated it so much. But I told you how God has justice, how God has the scales of time and history, that he's sovereign over those things. And if you read a little bit more about Hitler's story, on the morning of D-Day, Hitler slept in. Hitler slept in all the way till noon on that day. And Hitler had so micromanaged troop movement and wouldn't allow anyone else to do it. And when the Allied forces started to break through, Hitler was sound asleep, and he had done very strict guidelines that no advisor, that no other person could wake him or even touch him. So he slept, and he slept, and he got up around lunchtime, and the Allied forces had already broken through. So many brave men who lost their lives, many others that were wounded, they moved in, and Hitler was sound asleep. And I see this connection between Haman and Hitler even more. And you see in a book of the Bible where King Xerxes can't go to sleep one night. A king can't sleep. And now you see a horrible leader who oversleeps. And how God was working, how God was sovereign in those moments. See, God never promises that it will be easy. He never tells us that we'll be without blemish or that it will be a simple path. It's difficult and it's hard, and it develops trust and we learn about God's holiness and his justice in the process. But I want you to see from this book of Esther how God so lovingly cares for us, that he's committed to us as people. And he is sovereign. He is a God of justice. And those moments where we think that people in our lives who have done horrible things are going to get away from it, we have to remember that it is God who is the one who creates and gives justice. It is God who's the one who brings those things to be. That is his work. And you see that, and how we are called to be people who care about others. See, the beauty of Purim, the beauty of what Mordecai writes for us to his people is really found in chapter 9. If just for a moment, if you can look at these couple verses, I'll be done. It says in verse 9, or chapter 9, it says, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and the 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrows were turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote to them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. See, the beauty of this, the beauty of what happens to Mordecai here, is Mordecai instructs the people to bring justice, to bring it in a good way, to bring gifts, to care for the poor. And you see the beauty of following what God has called us to. We see the beauty of what it means to be a believer, that we have been the recipients of grace. We get to share that with others. And in this celebration, there was a great care for others, those that weren't, that didn't have. Now look at this beautiful book of Esther. I see how God works, how his fingerprints are over our lives, how his beautiful justice comes, and how it's redemptive for us as people. And today I pray that if you've never read the book, you'll go back through, that you see God's hand in this book, but that you see God's hand in each one of your lives, that you go in almost a theology of remembrance over what God has done for you and know that he will carry you through. Let's pray. Dear Father, thank you for loving us. Thank you for caring for us. Thank you for grace. Thank you for this beautiful book about Esther. Lord, I pray that we would be people that connect deeply with what it means to be redeemed, what it means to be your people. Lord, thank you for loving us. Father, thank you today that we can call you Father. And Lord, we're humbled by how good you have been. We ask your blessing, and as we sing together, may we know even more deeply what it means to be your children. Lord, thank you for the cross. Thank you for grace and mercy in each one of our lives. And we ask all these things in your name. Amen.